In a quiet Ohio courtroom, 17-year-old Cody Evans met the story of his own brutal crime with a chilling smile, a display of arrogance that baffled legal experts and devastated his victim's family. The evidence against him was overwhelming, but the true nature of his malice remained a dark puzzle, a void no one could explain. Yet the final, most damning piece of the puzzle would not come from a detective or a psychologist, but from the one person who knew the truth behind his empty eyes, his own mother. The last day of Liam Carter's life began with the mundane rhythm of a Midwestern summer in Shaker Heights, Ohio. He had worked an early shift at the local library, a job he loved for its quiet aisles and the smell of aging paper. Liam was a creature of gentle habits, a 19-year-old architecture student who sketched buildings in a worn notebook and called his mother every day at noon. That afternoon, he planned to finish a project for his portfolio, a detailed rendering of the historic Terminal Tower, before meeting friends for dinner. The Carters' home was a sanctuary of order and modest comfort, nestled on a street lined with mature oak trees whose leaves whispered in the August breeze. Sarah Carter had left a plate of cookies on the counter for Liam, a small maternal gesture she performed daily. His father, David, was at his accounting firm downtown, expecting Liam to call for a ride later that evening, as his car was in the shop. It was a day like any other, stitched together with the simple, unbreakable threads of familial love and routine. The first sign of rupture was a missed phone call, then another, a small tear in the fabric of their predictable day. Sarah Carter felt a knot of unease tighten in her stomach, an unfamiliar anxiety that she initially dismissed as overprotective worry. But when her calls went straight to voicemail and the sun began to dip below the tree line, that worry curdled into a cold, sharp dread. She drove home from her sister's house, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, rehearsing the scolding she would give Liam for being so thoughtless. She found him not in his room or the living room, but in the small studio he had made for himself in the back of the house. The scene was one of incomprehensible violence, a brutal violation of the peaceful space where her son had dreamed of building beautiful things. Liam Carter was gone, his life extinguished with a savagery that left no room for explanation, his portfolio lying open on the floor next to him, a silent testament to a future that had been stolen. The initial moments of the investigation felt like an intrusion, a second violation of the family's shattered peace. Shaker Heights police officers, their faces grim and professional, moved through the house with a somber purpose. Detectives asked questions that Sarah could not answer, her mind a fog of shock and unreality. The senselessness of the act hung heavy in the air. The television was gone, along with a laptop and a few $100s from a desk drawer, but the sheer brutality of the murder pointed to something far darker than a simple robbery. David Carter arrived to find his home cordoned off with yellow tape, a sight so alien it seemed to belong to a different world. He saw the look on the lead detective's face and knew in that instant that the foundation of his life had crumbled into dust. The loss of his son was not a gradual fading, but a violent amputation, leaving a raw, gaping wound where a future once was. The community reeled, unable to reconcile the peaceful, tree-lined streets of their suburb with the monstrous act that had occurred behind a familiar front door. Neighbors spoke of a teenager they had seen in the area, someone who didn't belong, his presence unsettling. They described a boy with a distinctive swagger and cold, watchful eyes, a description that would soon have a name. His name was Cody Evans, a 17-year-old from a neighboring district with a juvenile record for petty theft and a reputation for casual cruelty. He was not a stranger to the system, but no one could have predicted the capacity for violence that lay dormant behind his youthful facade. The evidence left at the scene was plentiful, the work of an amateur who believed himself to be invisible. Fingerprints were lifted from a side window, and a shoe print matching a popular brand of sneaker was found in the soft soil of a flower bed. Sarah Carter had planted just a week before. The stolen items were secondary. The primary mission of the detectives was to find the person responsible for the act of pure malice that had taken Liam Carter's life. The whys of it was a question that would haunt them, a chilling puzzle whose pieces were only just beginning to surface. The crime was a stone thrown into the placid lake of the community, its ripples spreading outward with terrifying speed. Friends of Liam gathered in stunned silence, their youthful optimism shattered by the proximity of such darkness. They remembered his easy laugh, his kindness, his unwavering belief in the good of people, making the nature of his death all the more obscene. He was a boy who built things, who saw beauty in structure and form, murdered in an act of pure, chaotic destruction. As the detectives pieced together their timeline, they realized the killer had likely watched the house, waiting for an opportunity. This wasn't a crime of pure impulse, it was a crime of predatory patience, which was even more terrifying. The perpetrator had waited for Liam to be alone, a wolf singling out its prey with a chilling and methodical precision. The community's sense of security, built on locked doors and trusting neighbors, was revealed to be a fragile illusion. The local news reported the story with a somber gravity, the anchor's voice a funereal drumbeat, counting out the grim details. A photograph of Liam, smiling and vibrant, was displayed on the screen, a stark contrast to the sterile language of homicide investigations. For the Carters, this public display of their private agony was another layer of pain, their son reduced to a headline, their grief a spectacle for strangers. They retreated into their home, a place now haunted by memory and loss, seeking refuge in a silence the world could not offer. The focus of the investigation quickly narrowed to Cody Evans, whose name came up through a series of anonymous tips and connections to other minor break-ins in the area. When detectives ran his name, they found a pattern of escalating delinquency that had been consistently minimized or dismissed. He was a ghost in the system, a boy who had learned to slip through the cracks, his escalating behavior a silent alarm that no one had heeded. The search for Cody Evans was no longer just about solving a murder, it was about capturing a shadow before it could consume another light. The arrest of Cody Evans was not a dramatic high-speed chase, but a quiet, almost anticlimactic event that stood in stark contrast to the violence of his crime. He was found 2 days later at a friend's apartment complex, playing video games as if nothing had happened. When the tactical team entered, he showed no surprise, no fear, and no resistance, only a flicker of annoyance at having his game interrupted. He dropped the controller, stood up, and placed his hands behind his back with a practiced ease that spoke of previous encounters with law enforcement. On the ride to the precinct, Cody was unnervingly calm, a placid lake of detachment in the back of the patrol car. He stared out the window at the passing landscape of Cleveland's east side, his expression unreadable. One of the arresting officers, a veteran of 20 years, would later describe the silence in the car as one of the most unsettling he had ever experienced. It was not the quiet of fear or shock, it was the quiet of utter emptiness, a void where human emotion should have been. In the sterile beige interrogation room, Cody sat slouched in a metal chair, a faint smirk playing on his lips. He was read his rights, a procedure he seemed to find tedious, and he waived his right to an attorney with a dismissive wave of his hand. He asked for a soda, and when Detective Miller placed the can on the table, Cody took a long, slow sip before looking up, his eyes holding a mixture of boredom and contempt. The interview began not with denials or lies, but with a chilling, unprompted question from the suspect himself. "So, what took you so long?" The confession that followed was delivered without a hint of remorse or hesitation, a flat, factual recitation of horrific events. Cody described breaking into the Carter house, expecting it to be empty, and his surprise at finding Liam Carter inside. He spoke of the confrontation with the same emotional detachment he might use to describe a scene from a movie, detailing the struggle and the escalation of violence in a monotone voice. He seemed to recall the events with perfect clarity, yet he spoke of them as if they had happened to someone else, a story he was simply retelling. Detective Miller, a seasoned homicide investigator who had seen the darkest corners of human nature, found himself struggling to maintain his professional composure. He pressed Cody for a reason, for a motive that went beyond a stolen laptop and a few dollars, but the teenager just shrugged. He was there, Cody said, as if that were explanation enough. There was no flicker of guilt in his eyes, no sign of a troubled conscience, only the profound and terrifying absence of one. The confession was a prosecutor's dream, a direct and unambiguous admission of guilt, recorded on video for a jury to see. Cody seemed to relish the attention, occasionally leaning into the microphone as he added a gruesome detail, watching the detectives for their reaction. It was a performance, a demonstration of his own perceived power and importance. He was the main character in this story, and the life he had taken was merely a footnote, an insignificant plot point in the narrative of his own grandiosity. He admitted to selling the stolen television for $200 and using the money to buy new sneakers and take his friends out for pizza. He recounted these details with a prideful tone, as if boasting about a clever business transaction. The life of Liam Carter, a promising young man with a future full of potential, had been bartered away for a fraction of its worth, and the killer saw no imbalance in the equation. This transactional view of human life was perhaps the most disturbing revelation of the entire confession. As the interview concluded, Cody asked another question, this one revealing the true depths of his delusion. "So I'll get juvie for this, right? Be out by 21? He wasn't asking, he was stating what he believed to be a fact, a loophole in the system designed just for him. The detectives didn't answer, their silence a heavy counterpoint to his arrogant certainty. In his mind, his age was a shield, an unbreakable armor that would protect him from any real consequences. The contrast between the two boys involved was a chasm of character. Liam Carter had spent his final hours sketching a historic landmark, an act of creation and appreciation for the world around him. Cody Evans had spent the days after the murder celebrating an act of selfish consumption and utter disregard for the world he had broken. One life was dedicated to building, the other to taking, and in that small studio in Shaker Heights, the forces of creation and destruction had met with catastrophic results. News of the arrest and confession spread quickly, bringing a sense of relief to the terrified community, but that relief was tainted by the chilling details that emerged. The lack of motive, the casual cruelty, the perpetrator's youth, it was a combination that defied easy understanding. People struggled to comprehend how a 17-year-old could commit such a heinous act and feel nothing. The case was no longer just about a murder. It became a dark meditation on the nature of evil itself. For the Carter family, the confession was a double-edged sword. It confirmed the identity of their son's killer, providing a certainty that many grieving families never receive. But the details of Cody's statement, his complete lack of remorse, and his casual dismissal of Liam's life plunged them into a new, deeper level of hell. Their son had not just been killed, he had been erased by someone who saw him as nothing more than an obstacle. The legal machinery began to turn, with the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office announcing its intention to try Cody Evans as an adult. Given the brutality of the crime and Cody's remorseless confession, it was a decision that was both expected and necessary. The shield of his youth, which Cody believed to be impenetrable, was about to be tested by the full weight of the adult justice system. His confident smirk in the interrogation room was the expression of a boy who had never faced a real consequence, a boy who was about to learn that some actions have a price that cannot be negotiated. The Cuyahoga County prosecutor assigned to the case was Assistant District Attorney Eleanor Barnes, a woman known for her methodical preparation and her unwavering focus in the courtroom. She had a reputation for being tough but fair, a legal mind that saw justice not as a passionate crusade, but as the careful construction of an unassailable argument. When she reviewed the case file on Cody Evans, she saw not a troubled teen who made a mistake, but a predator who had been allowed to evolve unchecked. The videotaped confession was the cornerstone of her case, a chillingly clear window into the defendant's mindset. Barnes and her team began the painstaking process of assembling their case, brick by evidentiary brick. They corroborated every detail of Cody's confession with physical evidence, creating a narrative so airtight it would leave no room for doubt. The fingerprints from the window matched Cody's, the shoe print in the flower bed was identical to the new sneakers he was wearing when arrested, and Liam Carter's DNA was found on the clothing Cody had worn during the murder. Each piece of forensic evidence was a silent witness, a fragment of truth that spoke to the violence of Liam's final moments. The prosecution's strategy was clear: to present Cody Evans not as a child, but as a killer who happened to be young. They planned to show the jury the full video of his confession, to let them see the smirk, hear the casual tone, and witness the profound emptiness in his eyes. Barnes knew that the defense would try to build a wall of sympathy around Cody, portraying him as a product of a difficult environment. Her job was to dismantle that wall with the hard, cold facts of the crime and the defendant's own remorseless words. Meanwhile, the court appointed a public defender to represent Cody Evans, a man named Michael Holloway. Holloway was an experienced, if somewhat world-weary, attorney who had spent his career representing the accused in the grimmest of circumstances. He believed everyone deserved a defense, but when he met his new client, that belief was tested. Cody treated their first meeting with the same disdain he had shown the detectives, his arrogance a palpable force in the small, windowless room. Holloway's first challenge was the confession, a damning piece of evidence that essentially guaranteed a conviction. His only viable strategy was mitigation, an attempt to lessen the severity of the sentence by influencing the court's perception of his client. He began to dig into Cody's past, searching for the narrative of a broken child, a story of neglect or abuse that could explain the monster who sat before him. He needed to find a reason, a source for the darkness, something a jury could latch onto as a mitigating factor. The picture that emerged from Cody's school records and social service files was one of chronic neglect and enablement. He was raised by a single mother, Sharon Evans, in a home marked by instability and a revolving door of transient figures. There were reports of truancy, of fights at school, of small cruelties inflicted on other children and animals that were consistently dismissed or ignored. It was a classic portrait of a budding sociopath, a child whose moral compass had never been set because no one had ever bothered to teach him north from south. Holloway saw the outline of a defense taking shape, a story he could tell about a boy who was failed by every adult in his life. He could argue that Cody was not born evil, but was molded into what he became by a world that showed him no empathy, and so he developed none of his own. It was a defense built on the shifting sands of nurture versus nature, a plea for understanding, if not for forgiveness. The challenge would be getting Cody to play the part of the victim, a role for which his personality was profoundly unsuited. As the prosecution built its mountain of evidence, Ada Barnes also prepared for the defense's strategy. She had her own investigators look into Cody's background, and they found the same story of neglect, but they also found something else. They discovered a pattern of manipulation and a history of Cody using his troubled childhood as a get-out-of-jail-free card for lesser offenses. He had learned early on how to play the victim, how to leverage his own misfortune to evade responsibility, a tactic that had always worked until now. Barnes decided to meet this defense head-on, to acknowledge the hardships of Cody's youth, but to frame them not as an excuse, but as a context for his choices. She would argue that many people endure difficult childhoods without becoming violent predators. The decision to break into a home, to confront a stranger, and to commit a brutal murder was a choice made by Cody Evans and him alone. She would insist that the jury focus not on the life he had lived, but on the life he had so viciously taken. The legal maneuvering began weeks before the trial, with Holloway filing motions to have the confession suppressed. He argued that Cody, as a minor, did not fully understand his rights when he waived them, a standard defense tactic in juvenile cases. The judge, a stern and experienced jurist named Maria Sanchez, reviewed the video of the interrogation and denied the motion without hesitation. She noted in her ruling that Cody Evans appeared to understand the proceedings perfectly and in fact seemed to enjoy his role at the center of them. This initial ruling was a significant blow to the defense and a major victory for the prosecution. The jury would see the confession in its entirety, and Holloway knew that the image of Cody smirking while describing a murder would be nearly impossible to overcome. His client was his own worst enemy, the primary exhibit in the prosecution's case against him. Holloway's job shifted from seeking an acquittal, which was never a realistic possibility, to simply trying to save his client from a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. The stage was being set for a courtroom battle that was less about guilt or innocence and more about the nature of culpability. The prosecution had the facts, the evidence, and the defendant's own words. The defense had a tragic backstory and a client who seemed determined to undermine any attempt to generate sympathy. In the middle were the Carters, a family forced to sit through the legal process and listen to arguments that would attempt to explain and perhaps excuse the person who had destroyed their world. Their quiet dignity became a powerful, silent presence in every pre-trial hearing, a constant reminder of what had been lost. In the weeks leading up to the trial, Michael Holloway's primary task was not legal strategy, but a desperate attempt at psychological coaching. He knew their only hope was to present a defendant who appeared, at the very least, to be humbled and remorseful for his actions. The challenge was that Cody Evans was constitutionally incapable of feigning an emotion he did not feel, and the only emotion he seemed to feel was a profound sense of entitlement. During their strategy sessions, Holloway would try to impress upon Cody the gravity of his situation, explaining the concept of a life sentence in stark, unambiguous terms. Cody would listen with a detached air, as if Holloway were discussing the fate of a stranger. When prompted to practice a somber expression, Cody would produce a theatrical pout that looked more like a parody of sadness than a genuine display of contrition. He could not grasp the idea that his own future hinged on his ability to convince others that he was sorry. The tension between the defense attorney and his client became a palpable friction. Holloway, operating from a place of professional duty and a flicker of human pity for a boy so lost, grew increasingly frustrated. Cody, operating from a place of pure narcissism, saw his lawyer's attempts to coach him as a sign of weakness, an annoying formality he had to endure. He believed his youth and the story of his rough upbringing were a magic key that would unlock any prison door, a belief his past experiences had done nothing to dispel. In one particularly tense session, Holloway tried to explain the importance of his demeanor in front of the jury. "They need to see that you regret what happened, Cody," Holloway urged, his voice tight with exasperation. Cody just laughed, a short, sharp bark of a sound. "Why would I regret it? He got in my way," he responded, his words delivered with a chilling simplicity that left Holloway speechless. It was in that moment the defense attorney understood he was not representing a misguided teen, he was representing a void. The pre-trial hearings became a public showcase for Cody's stunning lack of self-awareness. While ADA Barnes presented procedural motions with a calm and collected professionalism, Cody would slouch in his chair, occasionally whispering jokes to the bailiff or trying to catch the eye of a television news reporter in the gallery. His behavior was a constant disruption, a low-level hum of disrespect that did not go unnoticed by Judge Sanchez. She issued several stern warnings, which Cody seemed to treat as part of a game. This courtroom behavior created a serious ethical dilemma for Holloway. He was bound to provide a vigorous defense for his client, but his client was actively sabotaging any chance of a favorable outcome. Holloway's strategy depended on building a narrative of a redeemable youth, a boy who could still be saved. Yet the boy sitting next to him in court was doing everything in his power to present himself as an irredeemable monster, a character who had stepped from the pages of a clinical psychology textbook. The prosecution, meanwhile, watched these displays with a quiet, grim satisfaction. Cody's arrogance was more powerful than any argument Eleanor Barnes could make. He was, in effect, becoming her star witness. She instructed her team to simply let him be himself, confident that his true nature would do more to convince the jury of his culpability than any piece of forensic evidence. The mask of remorse that Holloway was trying to craft was not just failing to hold, it was a mask Cody refused to even wear. Cody's mother, Sharon Evans, was a spectral presence at some of these hearings. She would slip into the back of the courtroom, a small, weary woman who seemed to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. She would watch her son, her expression a mixture of pain, fear, and something else that was harder to define, a deep, ingrained shame. She never approached the defense team, and she never tried to speak to her son, who seemed to barely acknowledge her existence. Holloway had attempted to interview Sharon, hoping she could provide some key insight into Cody's past that would be useful for the defense. The meeting had been brief and unproductive. She was guarded and evasive, offering vague platitudes about Cody being a good boy who had fallen in with a bad crowd. It was a well-rehearsed script, one she had likely used many times before, but her eyes betrayed a truth, her words tried to conceal. Holloway left the meeting with the distinct impression that she was hiding something, a dark chapter in their family history she was unwilling to share. As the trial date approached, the defense was in disarray. Their narrative of a troubled but salvageable youth was being systematically dismantled by the defendant himself. Cody's inability to grasp the concept of consequences, a trait likely nurtured over a lifetime of being shielded from them, had now become his greatest liability. He was walking into a legal battle armed with a sense of invincibility, a flimsy shield against the hardened steel of the justice system. The final pre-trial hearing concluded with a moment that served as a grim foreshadowing of the trial to come. As the Carters were leaving the courtroom, their faces etched with a quiet, dignified sorrow, Cody caught David Carter's eye. Instead of looking away in shame, Cody offered a slow, deliberate smirk, an act of such profound disrespect that a gasp rippled through the gallery. David Carter froze, his fists clenching at his sides, before his wife gently pulled him away, but the image was seared into the minds of everyone who saw it, the unrepentant killer taunting the father of the boy he had murdered. Holloway put his head in his hands, a gesture of complete and utter defeat. The mask of remorse had not just slipped, it had been torn off and stomped on by its intended wearer. He knew then that the trial would not be a fight for acquittal or even a plea for mercy. It would be a damage control operation of the highest order, a desperate attempt to contain the fallout from the personality of his own client, a boy who laughed in the face of his own damnation. The first day of the trial in the Cuyahoga County Court of Common Pleas began under a heavy sky that threatened rain. The courtroom was packed, a silent assembly of journalists, community members, and the two families at the center of the tragedy. On one side sat the Carters, stoic and unified in their grief, their presence a somber anchor in the room. On the other side sat Cody Evans, dressed in an ill-fitting suit provided by his attorney, an outfit that looked like a costume on his lean, restless frame. The jury was selected with a careful, deliberate slowness, a process of weeding through the pool of citizens to find 12 people who could look upon the defendant and see a human being rather than a headline. ADA Barnes and Michael Holloway questioned potential jurors for hours, probing for biases and preconceived notions. Barnes sought jurors who valued responsibility and order, while Holloway looked for those who might possess a well of empathy for a troubled youth, a search that felt increasingly futile. Once the jury was seated, the trial began in earnest with the opening statements. Eleanor Barnes approached the jury box with a quiet confidence, her voice even and measured as she began to speak. She painted a picture of Liam Carter, not as a flawless saint, but as a good, kind young man full of promise, a son, a friend, a student whose future was a bright and expanding horizon. She then described the crime in stark, unflinching detail, a brutal act of violence that was as senseless as it was savage. Her voice never rose, yet her words landed with the force of hammer blows. "This is not a case about a troubled childhood," she stated, looking directly at the jury, her gaze sweeping over each of their faces. "It is a case about a conscious choice. The choice to break into a home, the choice to take a life for a television and a laptop, and the choice to feel absolutely nothing about it." She concluded by promising to show them the evidence, the facts, and the defendant's own words, which would lead them to one inescapable conclusion. As Barnes spoke, Cody watched her with a look of detached amusement, a slight smirk playing on his lips. He occasionally glanced over at the jury, then at his own lawyer, as if sharing an inside joke. His body language was a broadcast of arrogance, his casual posture a declaration that these proceedings were a minor inconvenience, a boring play he was being forced to sit through before he could go home. Then it was Michael Holloway's turn. He rose slowly, his shoulders slumped as if under a great weight, a stark contrast to Barnes' crisp professionalism. He approached the jury not as a prosecutor, laying out a case, but as a storyteller begging for understanding. He spoke of a system that had failed Cody Evans at every turn, of a childhood devoid of stability, guidance, and love. He portrayed Cody not as the predator, but as the prey of a harsh and unforgiving world. "We are not here to excuse the tragic death of Liam Carter," Holloway said, his voice soft and pleading. "We are here to understand how a boy like Cody Evans could end up in that house, on that day. We are here to look at the long, dark road that led to that moment, a road paved with neglect and abandonment. He was building a defense on a foundation of pity, the only foundation he had left. It was a narrative designed to make the jury see a lost child instead of a cold-blooded killer." The effectiveness of Holloway's words, however, was completely neutralized by the very person he was trying to defend. As his lawyer painted a picture of a tragic, broken boy, Cody let out a soft but clearly audible snort of derision. The sound was small, but in the charged silence of the courtroom, it was like a gunshot. A juror in the front row flinched, her eyes darting from Holloway to Cody, her expression shifting from one of concentration to one of disbelief and disgust. The opening statements set the stage for the psychological drama that would unfold over the coming weeks. The prosecution's case was a straightforward, methodical presentation of facts. The defense's case was a fragile, desperate appeal to emotion. And at the center of it all was a defendant who seemed intent on proving the prosecution's point with his every glance, his every smirk, his every shift in his chair. Throughout that first day, Cody's behavior grew more blatant. He would yawn dramatically during procedural arguments, tap his fingers on the table in a restless rhythm, and even attempt to make eye contact with a young female reporter in the gallery, offering her a wink. Each action was a small act of defiance, a way of asserting his own perceived control over a situation in which he had none. He did not understand that the courtroom had its own language, a silent vocabulary of respect and solemnity, and his flagrant disregard for its grammar was alienating the very people who held his fate in their hands. The Carters, for their part, endured this display with a heartbreaking grace. They never looked at Cody, their gazes fixed on the judge, the prosecutor, or the witness stand. Their grief was a quiet, powerful force, a silent rebuke to the defendant's juvenile theatrics. They were there for their son, to bear witness to the process of justice, and they would not allow the killer's contemptuous behavior to distract them from that solemn duty. By the end of the first day, a clear dynamic had been established. The trial was not a contest between the prosecution and the defense. It was a battle between the defense and its own client. Holloway's carefully constructed narrative of a sympathetic victim was a house of cards, and Cody was a gale-force wind, blowing it all down with his own arrogant breath. Judge Sanchez, observing everything from her elevated bench, had an expression of stern disapproval that was becoming permanently etched on her face. The trial had only just begun, but for many in the courtroom, the verdict already felt like a foregone conclusion, written not in the law books, but in the defendant's chilling, remorseless smile. The prosecution's phase of the trial was a masterclass in methodical, dispassionate presentation of fact. ADA Eleanor Barnes called her witnesses in a precise and logical order, each one adding a new, irrefutable layer to the case against Cody Evans. She began with the first responders, the police officers and paramedics who were the first to enter the Carter home and witness the horror of the scene. Their testimony was grim and clinical, painting a picture of violence that was both shocking and deeply personal. Next came the forensic experts, the scientists who had analyzed the evidence collected from the crime scene. A fingerprint analyst testified that the prints lifted from the window pane were a perfect match to Cody Evans. A DNA expert confirmed that the blood found under Liam Carter's fingernails, a sign of his desperate fight for life, belonged to the defendant. Each piece of scientific evidence was presented with charts and graphs, cold, hard data that formed a web from which Cody could not escape. Throughout this damning testimony, Cody's behavior escalated from passive disrespect to active contempt. When the crime scene photographs were displayed on the large screen for the jury, showing the brutal reality of what he had done, he did not look away in shame. Instead, he leaned forward, studying the images with a detached curiosity, as if analyzing a piece of abstract art. A wave of revulsion swept through the courtroom, and one of the younger jurors had to visibly fight back tears. The emotional core of the prosecution's case came from the testimony of Liam Carter's friends and family. Sarah Carter took the stand, her voice trembling but her resolve firm, and spoke about her son. She did not speak of the murder, but of his life, his dreams, his kindness, and the small, everyday moments that she now cherished as priceless treasures. She humanized the victim, transforming him from a name in a case file back into a beloved son whose absence had left an unfillable void in their world. During Sarah Carter's testimony, Cody's smirk returned, a faint but unmistakable upturning of his lips. He watched her with an unnerving intensity, his eyes cold and clinical. It was a display of such profound lack of empathy that it seemed to suck the very air out of the room. Michael Holloway placed a hand on his client's arm, a silent plea for him to stop, but Cody shrugged it off, his gaze never leaving the grieving mother on the stand. The final and most powerful piece of the prosecution's evidence was the videotaped confession. The courtroom lights were dimmed and the screens flickered to life, showing the interrogation room and the 17-year-old boy who now sat just a few feet away from the jury. For 45 minutes, the jury watched as Cody Evans, in his own words, calmly and casually described how he had murdered Liam Carter. They heard his boastful tone, saw his dismissive shrugs, and witnessed his pride in the meager profits of his crime. The moment from the tape that sealed his fate was his response when asked why he did it. The sound of his voice filled the silent courtroom. He was there. The words hung in the air, a testament to a complete and utter devaluing of human life. This was followed by his confident assertion that he would only serve a few years in a juvenile facility. The jurors watched the screen, and then their eyes would shift to the defendant's table where the real Cody Evans was watching himself on screen with a look of smug satisfaction. The boy on the tape and the boy in the courtroom were one and the same, unrepentant, arrogant, and devoid of a soul. Ada Barnes rested her case after the video, a strategic move that left the confession as the final lingering impression in the minds of the jury. She had built an unshakable fortress of facts, forensics, and the defendant's own self-incriminating performance. She had not only proven that Cody Evans had committed the murder, but she had also provided a terrifying glimpse into why he had done it for no reason at all, which was the most frightening reason of all. As the prosecution concluded, the atmosphere in the courtroom was heavy with a sense of grim certainty. The evidence was overwhelming, but it was the defendant's reaction to that evidence that had truly condemned him. He had laughed at the system, shown contempt for the victim's family, and displayed a chilling pride in his own monstrousness. His behavior was a constant, screaming testament to his own guilt, a confession that continued long after the video had been turned off. Michael Holloway knew he was facing an impossible task. The prosecution had presented a case that was not just strong, but emotionally devastating. Any sympathy he might have hoped to generate for his client had been systematically annihilated by Cody himself. His plan to portray Cody as a victim of his circumstances now seemed not just difficult, but absurd, a flimsy narrative in the face of such overwhelming evidence of his client's malice. The judge called for a recess, and as the jury filed out of the room, their faces were grim and set. They avoided looking at the defendant, their gazes directed toward the floor. It was a subtle but clear signal that their minds were already closing, the door of reasonable doubt being shut and locked. Cody, however, seemed oblivious to this, stretching his arms over his head and yawning as if he had just woken from a nap, a final act of disrespect in a day filled with them. The prosecution had rested its case, but the trial of Cody Evans's character was far from over. Michael Holloway began his defense under a cloud of palpable skepticism from the jury. His task was akin to convincing a gathering of sailors that the sea was not in fact wet. He had to build a counter-narrative powerful enough to overcome not only the mountain of evidence presented by the prosecution, but also the deeply negative impression left by his own client. His strategy remained the same: to reframe Cody Evans from a cold-blooded killer into a tragic product of a broken system. His first witness was a social worker who had handled Cody's case file intermittently over the years. She testified to the chaotic and neglectful environment of his upbringing, detailing a childhood marked by poverty, a transient mother, and a complete lack of a stable father figure. She spoke from her notes, her voice a monotone recitation of missed appointments, ignored recommendations, and a family that consistently slipped through the cracks of an overburdened social services system. The story was tragic, a textbook case of a child set on a path to failure. Holloway then called a forensic psychologist, a man who had conducted a series of evaluations on Cody. The psychologist testified that Cody exhibited strong traits of antisocial personality disorder coupled with a severe attachment disorder stemming from his childhood. He explained that Cody's inability to feel empathy or remorse was not a choice, but a psychological condition, a form of brain wiring that was the direct result of years of emotional and physical neglect. He argued that Cody lacked the fundamental capacity to understand the moral weight of his actions. In a sense, the psychologist concluded, Cody Evans is blind. He is emotionally blind. He cannot see the pain he causes in others because he was never taught the language of human connection. It was a compelling argument, an attempt to medicalize Cody's monstrosity, to transform his evil into a treatable or at least understandable pathology. It was the defense's best and only chance to introduce an element of doubt, not about what Cody did, but about his level of culpability for doing it. Throughout this testimony designed to save him, Cody appeared profoundly bored. He doodled on a legal pad, his drawings a series of violent and grotesque caricatures. At one point, during the psychologist's description of his emotional deficits, Cody caught the eye of Ada Barnes and theatrically tapped his head and rolled his eyes, as if to say, "Can you believe this guy?" The prosecutor simply stared back, her expression unreadable, letting his behavior speak for itself. The cross-examination of the defense's witnesses was where Ada Barnes truly excelled. She was surgical in her questioning, her tone never wavering from a calm, analytical professionalism. When questioning the social worker, she brought up numerous instances where services and support were offered to Cody's family only to be refused or ignored. She established a pattern not just of a system failing a child, but of a family actively resisting any form of intervention or help. Her cross-examination of the psychologist was even more devastating. Barnes did not challenge the diagnosis, but rather its implications. "Doctor," she began, "would you agree that many people suffer from difficult childhoods, even from personality disorders, and yet do not go on to commit brutal, violent murders?" The psychologist had to concede that this was true. So while his condition might explain his lack of empathy, she continued, pressing her advantage, "It does not remove his ability to make a choice, does it? He chose to enter that house. He chose to pick up a weapon. Is that correct?" The psychologist, cornered by logic, could only agree. In a few short questions, Barnes had dismantled the core of the defense. She had acknowledged Cody's troubled past and his psychological issues, but she had successfully reframed them not as an excuse for his actions, but merely as a context. She had restored the element of choice, of personal responsibility, which was the central pillar of the prosecution's argument. Holloway's final witness was supposed to be Cody's mother, Sharon Evans. He had hoped she would take the stand and deliver a tearful, heartfelt plea, humanizing her son and reinforcing the narrative of a tragic upbringing, but in a last-minute meeting, she had refused. She was agitated and fearful, telling Holloway that she couldn't do it, offering no further explanation. Her refusal left a gaping hole in the defense's narrative, the absence of a mother's love, a silent testament to the family's dysfunction. With no other witnesses to call, Michael Holloway was forced to rest his case. It felt less like a conclusion and more like a surrender. His attempt to build a sympathetic narrative had been a resounding failure, undermined at every turn by the facts of the case and the undeniable reality of his client's character. The jury had been presented with a story of a broken boy, but they had spent days watching that boy behave not as a victim, but as a predator who wore his cruelty like a crown. The defense's narrative had collapsed. It was a fragile structure built on psychological theory and a tragic backstory, but it could not withstand the weight of Cody's own personality. He had sat in the courtroom as a living, breathing rebuttal to his own defense. The psychologist had spoken of his emotional blindness, but the jury had seen the focused, deliberate cruelty in his eyes as he smirked at the Carter family. They had heard he was a victim of neglect, but they had witnessed his utter contempt for everyone who tried to help him, including his own lawyer. The defense had rested, but the most damning evidence against Cody Evans remained seated at the defendant's table. With the defense having rested, the trial moved into its final phase before jury deliberation, the victim impact statements. This was the opportunity for the family of Liam Carter to address the court and the man who had murdered him directly. It was not evidence, and it could not be used by the jury to determine guilt, but it was a crucial part of the human drama of justice, a moment for the voice of the victim to be heard in a process so often dominated by legal procedure. David Carter was the first to speak. He walked to the lectern with a heavy, deliberate gait, a man aged by a grief that was almost visible, like a shroud around his shoulders. He did not look at Cody. His statement was addressed to the court, but it was a quiet, intimate conversation with the memory of his son. He spoke of teaching Liam how to ride a bike, of their shared love for Cleveland's baseball team, and of the pride he felt watching his son grow into a man of kindness and integrity. "My son was a builder," David Carter said, his voice thick with emotion but steady. He wanted to create things of beauty and permanence. "The person who took his life is the opposite of everything he was. He is a destroyer, a force of emptiness." As he spoke, a profound silence settled over the courtroom, the weight of a father's loss pressing down on everyone present. He concluded his statement by looking at the judge. "All we ask for is justice for Liam, a justice that reflects the value of the life that was stolen from us." Next was Sarah Carter. She held a framed photograph of Liam, a picture of him smiling on his high school graduation day. She spoke of the silence in their house, the quiet that was once peaceful but was now a constant, painful reminder of his absence. She described the simple daily torments of a grieving mother, seeing his favorite cereal in the grocery store, accidentally setting a place for him at the dinner table, waking up in the morning, and for a fleeting second, forgetting that he was gone. "There is a hole in our world that will never be filled," she said, her voice breaking for the first time. "He was our only son, our future. When he was killed, a part of us died with him, and the wound that was left will never heal." Her pain was raw, unfiltered, and deeply human, a stark contrast to the cold, clinical proceedings that had preceded it. The entire courtroom, from the jury to the journalists, was visibly moved. Throughout these heart-wrenching statements, Cody Evans remained impassive, a statue of indifference. He did not flinch, he did not look away, he did not show a single flicker of human feeling. He watched the grieving parents with the same detached curiosity he had shown for the crime scene photos, as if they were specimens under a microscope. His lack of reaction was, in its own way, more shocking than any outburst could have been. It was the final, irrefutable confirmation of the void inside him. The final straw, the moment that pushed the proceedings into uncharted territory, came as Sarah Carter finished her statement and walked back to her seat. As she passed the defense table, her eyes still wet with tears, Cody leaned toward his lawyer and whispered something, a small smile playing on his lips. The whisper was followed by a soft, almost inaudible chuckle, but in the charged silence, it was as loud as a scream. A bailiff standing near the table stiffened. A D.A. Barnes, who was watching Cody intently, saw the exchange and her eyes narrowed. Michael Holloway, who heard what his client said, visibly slumped, a look of utter horror and defeat washing over his face. The judge, who saw the entire interaction, removed her glasses and placed them on the bench, her expression one of cold, controlled fury. The breaking point had been reached. The defendant's contempt for the proceedings, for the victim, and for the very concept of human decency had finally boiled over in a single, quiet, monstrous act. He had laughed. He had laughed at a mother's tears, at a father's pain, at the memory of the boy he had murdered. It was an act of psychological violence that was in that moment as brutal as the physical act that had brought them all here. Before Judge Sanchez could speak, a commotion arose from the back of the courtroom. A woman stood up, her voice shaking but clear. "Your Honor," she called out, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Your Honor, I have to speak." It was Sharon Evans, Cody's mother, her face pale and streaked with tears, her hands trembling. All eyes in the courtroom turned to her, a collective gasp rippling through the gallery. Michael Holloway turned, his face a mask of disbelief. Odetta Barnes stood motionless, sensing that the case was about to take a turn that no one could have predicted. Judge Sanchez stared down at the woman standing in the back of her courtroom, a mother who had, until this moment, been a ghost in the proceedings. "Please approach the bench," the judge said, her voice low and grave. The breaking point had arrived, and it had brought with it a witness no one had ever expected to hear from. Sharon Evans walked to the witness stand, as if in a trance, her movements slow and uncertain. She did not look at her son, who watched her approach with a new expression on his face, one that was not of arrogance or boredom, but of pure, cold fury. This was a variable he had not accounted for, a betrayal he had not anticipated. His mother, the silent enabler who had always been his safety net, was about to break the unspoken pact that had defined their lives. ADA Barnes, recognizing the seismic shift that was occurring, requested permission to question the witness, a request the judge granted immediately. Michael Holloway could only sit, stunned into silence, as the narrative he had tried to control completely unraveled. Sharon Evans was sworn in, her hand trembling as she placed it on the Bible, her voice barely a whisper as she promised to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Barnes began gently, her voice soft and encouraging, sensing the woman's fragility. "Mrs. Evans, why have you decided to speak now?" Sharon took a deep, shuddering breath, her eyes finding her son for the first time. "Because I saw his face," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "When that poor woman was talking about her son, my son," he laughed. "I saw it, and I realized I made him." What followed was not a legal testimony, but a confession, a mother's agonizing act of penance, She dismantled the defense's narrative piece by painful piece, not by challenging the facts of his neglectful childhood, but by revealing her own role in creating the monster who sat at the defense table. She spoke of a darkness she had seen in Cody from a very young age, a chilling lack of empathy that had frightened her. She told the court about the neighborhood pets that had gone missing, the small fires he set, the way he would look at her with empty, calculating eyes when he was denied something he wanted. "I was scared of him," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "Even when he was little. But I was his mother. So I made excuses. I told myself it was a phase, that he was just a boy being a boy. When he got in trouble at school, I blamed the teachers. When he was caught stealing, I paid the store owners and begged them not to call the police." Each sentence was an indictment of her own failure, a catalogue of cowardice and complicity. She described a long history of unchecked violence and entitlement, a pattern she had not just ignored, but actively enabled. She told the story of how, when Cody was 14, he had brutally beaten another boy who had insulted him, leaving him with a broken arm. She had driven the boy to the hospital herself, claiming he had fallen, and given his parents $5,000 to keep them from pressing charges. "I taught him that money could fix anything," she sobbed. "I taught him that there were no consequences for his actions, not for him." The courtroom was utterly silent, captivated by the raw, devastating power of her words. The jury leaned forward, their faces a mixture of pity and horror. Cody's face had become a mask of rage, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. This was the ultimate betrayal, the truth, spoken by the one person who had always helped him hide from it. His own mother was handing the prosecution the missing piece of the puzzle, the psychological context that explained everything. Barnes guided her through the testimony, her questions simple and direct, allowing Sharon's story to unfold in its own tragic timeline. "Mrs. Evans, the defense has argued that your son is a product of a failed system. Would you agree with that?" Sharon shook her head, a violent, sorrowful motion. "The system didn't fail him," she said, her voice cracking. "I did. I failed him. I failed everyone. I saw the monster growing inside my own house, and I watered it. I fed it. I protected it." Her testimony was the devastating character revelation that the prosecution had always suspected but could never prove. It wasn't new physical evidence, but it was something far more powerful. It was the truth behind the carefully constructed defense, the confirmation that Cody's sociopathy was not just a product of neglect, but of a malignant nurturing. He was not a ship lost at sea, he was a pirate who had been given a map, a compass, and a flag by his own mother. She concluded her testimony by looking directly at the judge, her gaze pleading. "He has no soul. I know that now. He feels nothing for that boy he killed, nothing for that poor family, and nothing for me. Please, don't let his age fool you. He's not a child. He was never a child." With those words, she finally broke down completely, her body racked with sobs of profound, soul-deep grief and guilt. The impact of her testimony was immediate and irreversible. It had not just destroyed the defense's narrative, it had incinerated it. The image of a broken boy, a victim of circumstance, had been replaced by the image of a coddled predator, a monster who had been shielded from responsibility his entire life. And the final, most damning piece of evidence had been delivered by the very person who had created him. The jury's deliberation was remarkably brief. After weeks of testimony, it took them less than 2 hours to reach a verdict. When they filed back into the jury box, their faces were solemn and resolute. The court clerk took the verdict slip from the foreman, and the rustle of the paper was the only sound in the cavernous room. Cody Evans, who had regained his composure and his smirk, watched with a look of supreme confidence, still convinced that his youth was an impenetrable shield. The clerk read the verdict in a clear, steady voice. "On the charge of aggravated murder, we, the jury, find the defendant, Cody Evans, guilty." A collective sigh of relief and sorrow went through the side of the courtroom where the Carter family sat. David Carter wrapped an arm around his wife, who closed her eyes, tears of grief and catharsis tracing paths down her cheeks. On the other side of the aisle, Sharon Evans sat alone, her head bowed, her shoulders shaking silently. Cody's smirk flickered for the first time. A crack appeared in the armor of his arrogance, a flicker of confusion in his cold eyes. He glanced at his lawyer, Michael Holloway, as if expecting him to fix this, to rewind the proceedings and produce the outcome he had been promised by his own sense of entitlement. Holloway could only meet his gaze with a look of grim resignation. The jury had done its job. Now the final act belonged to Judge Maria Sanchez. Because Cody was tried as an adult but was still a minor, the sentencing was at the judge's discretion, a decision that would determine whether he would ever have a chance at freedom again. Judge Sanchez scheduled the sentencing for the following week, a period of agonizing anticipation for everyone involved. When the day came, the courtroom was once again filled to capacity, a silent audience waiting for the final word on the value of a life and the cost of taking it. Judge Sanchez began by addressing the courtroom, her voice filled with a gravity that commanded absolute attention. She acknowledged the pain of the Carter family, praising their dignity and grace throughout an unimaginable ordeal. She then turned her gaze to the defendant's table, and her expression hardened into one of stern, righteous anger. She was no longer just a judge. She was the voice of a society that had been violated by a senseless act of cruelty. "Mr. Evans," she began, her voice cutting through the silence, "I have presided over many tragic cases in this courtroom. I have seen violence, I have seen sorrow, and I have seen remorse. In you, Mr. Evans, I see only a chilling, bottomless emptiness." She spoke of his behavior during the trial, his smirking, his laughter, his utter contempt for the process and for the sanctity of the life he had taken. "You have shown this court less emotion than if you had been on trial for a traffic violation," she said, her words a stinging indictment. She then addressed the defense's arguments, acknowledging his difficult upbringing but refusing to accept it as an excuse. "But the most clarifying testimony," she continued, her eyes finding Sharon Evans in the back of the courtroom, "came from your own mother. She did not describe a system that failed you. She described a boy who was given every opportunity to choose a different path and who, at every turn, chose cruelty. She described a mother who, out of fear and misguided love, shielded you from the consequences of those choices." "Your mother's testimony," the judge said, her voice rising with power, "was an act of ultimate, heartbreaking responsibility. It is a responsibility you have shown you are utterly incapable of understanding. She taught this court that you are not a misguided child who made a terrible mistake. You are a predator who has been coddled and protected your entire life, and your arrogance is the direct result of that protection." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Then she looked directly at Cody, whose confident smirk had completely vanished, replaced by a pale, slack-jawed expression of disbelief. The reality of his situation, the finality of it, was at last beginning to penetrate the thick wall of his narcissism. "This court will not be your final enabler, Mr. Evans," Judge Sanchez declared, her voice ringing with authority. "The consequences you have evaded for your entire life stop here. They stop today. For the murder of Liam Carter, a crime of exceptional brutality and depravity, this court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole." The words landed like a physical blow. The color drained from Cody's face. His delusion of invincibility shattered in an instant, the shards of his arrogance falling away to reveal the terrified, pathetic child he had always been underneath. A strangled gasp escaped his lips. For the first time, he looked not like a monster, but like a cornered animal, his eyes wide with a dawning, abject terror. As the bailiffs moved in to escort him out of the courtroom, his composure finally broke completely. He began to struggle, to cry, his confident facade crumbling into a desperate, wailing plea. "No, you can't. I'm only 17, he screamed, his voice cracking with a fear he had never shown before. The laughter was gone. The smirk was gone, replaced by the raw, ugly sound of a consequence finally and irrevocably delivered. He was no longer the one in control, and the realization broke him. The Carters watched him being dragged away, not with triumph, but with a profound, weary sadness. Justice had been served, but it would not bring their son back. As Cody Evans disappeared from the courtroom, his cries echoing in the hallway, a heavy peace settled over the room. The long, dark performance was over, and the boy who laughed at the judge had finally been silenced by the one truth he could no longer escape, the truth of a locked door.